And then we're going to go from that into what we call the bipolar worldview, which is how the world starts to get divided between these two very, very different governmental systems that are represented by the US and the USSR, even though they're not solely the US and USSR. So we're going to talk about how the world kind of gets divided between these forces after World War II on Thursday. And then on Tuesday and Thursday of next week, we're going to pick up some of the pieces we dropped because we were supposed to be covering that all week. So we're going to power through this. And by the end of next week, we should be where we were going to be anyway, but we're just going to handle it just a little bit differently. So it's good if you watched those videos. Those are just handy, useful videos. But let's talk about how we get into World War I or World War II. The biggest thing you need to know is that between World War I and World War II, there was a rise in fascism. Okay, so let's talk for just a second about what fascism actually is. This is a fasc, or fasces, and it is a bundle of sticks that you pull together, and then a bundle of sticks roped together is stronger than a single stick. Okay, and that's in Ephesians, I think. A bundle of sticks roped together is stronger than a single stick. And the reason for that is because they prevent each other from breaking. So when you're talking about a societal system, in order for a bundle of sticks to be stronger than a single stick, everything has to be going the same direction. Nothing has a whole lot of freedom of movement. Everything has to be in agreement, okay? So that's why the visual of a fascist works for fascism. The power of the group is more important than the power of the individual. Giving over your will to the will of the group is more important than having your own individual identity. Everybody should have the same message. Nobody should have opposing opinions. Opposing viewpoints are bad. So fascist societies, in order to carry out a fascist society, you have to make sure everybody aligns to the same ideas and aligns to the same principles, which means controlling the press, which means controlling the government. And usually the easiest way to do that is to put everything under the control of a single individual and model it after that. Fascism tends to rise after times of turmoil. So between World War I and World War II, some of the countries that had struggled more, that lost basically World War I, were in a worse position and needed that sense of strength because they were in a weakened position. This is a picture of Italy after World War I. This is a picture of something that happened in Germany after World War I. A German housewife is burning money in her stove because it's actually cheaper to burn money than it is to use money to buy firewood. You know, the economy was so weak. So it was in these societies, these weakened societies, that people yearned for that strength and were willing to give up their own individual rights in order to have that feeling of strength. In Italy, this coalesced under Benito Mussolini. Now, y'all had a document to read by him. It's kind of thick, kind of hard to read, but you probably want to take a look at it before the next exam. Hey, Jordan. Yay. You're alive. Seatbelt notwithstanding. Okay, so Benito Mussolini, these are his parents. I don't know why I have his parents in here, actually. I guess he himself suffered before World War I. He was actually arrested for vagrancy. So like, we're not talking about a well-heeled individual to begin with. We're not talking about somebody who came from a family of wealth. He edited a socialist newspaper before World War I during that rise in socialism, the message, the embrace the Red Book Marxism kind of things, you know. He was part of that movement that kind of swept across Europe that was all about the socialism. And then he served as, I think it was a corporal in World War I, but I'd have to look. Somebody would have to Google how high he actually ranked by the time he finished. But as he rose in prestige and gathered forces around him, he rose to power by gathering a coalition of people to whom fascism appeals. Disgruntled veterans, urban workers, people who are working in factories and want better working conditions, the same people to whom socialism had originally appealed. Romantic nationalists, people who believe that Italy itself should be in a better position after you know, everything that they've been through, that Italy should be strong and should be a strong country instead of a bunch of different little regions that are all fighting with each other. Business owners, small and large, actually, business owners, anybody who had a vested interest in seeing that, you know, the government oversight didn't get too strong. People who own land, and church leaders were all.
Hey, Mindy?
Yes.
Excuse me, Mindy, he was a corporal, just like Hitler.
Okay, I thought so, but I want to thanks for double checking that for me. Okay, as a part of this movement of disgruntled people gathered together, they actually marched on Rome and basically took over the government in Rome. In Germany, the rise of fascism came as a result of the Treaty of Versailles, which was categorized by disgruntled parties as a stab in the back. Remember that we talked about last week, we talked about the fact that the Treaty of Versailles was signed while there were still soldiers in the field, still fighting and still thinking they could win. They were still out there, and in urban centers where people were starving, cut off from their supplies, and where the enemy was closing in every day and the women and children were in danger, these weak individuals who probably didn't really have Germany's best interest at heart and might have even been Jews, signed the Treaty of Versailles specifically to undercut, you know, the future of the German people. So that Treaty of Versailles was itself so crippling to German morale, to German fortunes, to German destiny, that it was the basis for a rise in fervor in, you know, we need to get our country back kind of fervor, which when you say we need to get our country back, we all need to agree with each other on what that means, which is where fascism kind of comes in. Remember, in the Treaty of Versailles, they lost, they were given complete blame for World War I, and therefore all of the responsibility for paying back everybody's expenses in World War I, all of the reparations. But one of the biggest things they lost was territory. Leading up to World War I, Germany had become a spreading empire, just like Britain was and just like France was. They had put a lot of their identity in the fact that they were an expansionist empire, and they had gained territory in some really nice places. And the Treaty of Versailles took some of that territory away, even though it didn't have anything to do with the war. You know, to the Germans, this was really insulting. For example, the Rhineland. The fact that this was taken away, the Saarland was taken away to be administered by France as almost like hey, we're splitting Germany up with the Treaty of Versailles. Y'all want a piece? This piece is nice. It's all fertile. It's pretty. You'll like it. It's almost like that kind of concession. They achieved this part of Poland in the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk with Russia before the end of World War I. So Russia gave Germany that part of Poland in exchange for letting them back gracefully out of the war and not attacking them anymore. That was a treaty that was negotiated between Germany and Russia. But the Treaty of Versailles took it away. The Treaty of Versailles made what was called the Anschluss, which made it illegal for Germany to annex Austria. Austria and Germany are never allowed to join up and become one country, which is weird because you know what language they speak basically in Austria? The same High German that they spoke in Prussia. I mean, it's not the same language exactly, but it's close enough that the people identified as Germans. I mean, Hitler was from Austria, you know, and identified himself as German. So we've got several different areas where they had gained ground as an empire and were being taken that ground away and being told you're not allowed to expand anymore also. You also have to keep your military below everybody else's military. And you are responsible for paying back every dollar that was lost by the Allies in World War I. What this led to was a period of economic turmoil. Let's see. What this led to was a period of economic turmoil that was horrific for the German economy. One of the biggest things is the inflation of the mark. From breakfast to dinner, the value of a mark could plummet. So like a sandwich that cost you 3 marks at breakfast time would cost you 27 marks at dinner time. because the value of the mark, the value of the German money would just plummet and plummet and plummet and plummet until, in order to buy a loaf of bread, you needed like a mafia suitcase full of money, and it was just paper. It was worthless. But this hyperinflation made it impossible for people to earn a living during the day. In the middle of the 20s, French and Belgian troops marched into the Ruhr Valley next to Rhineland to take occupation of it and to make sure that Germany was paying their reparations and to bully German residents, basically. So it was humiliating that the French troops marched into what was historically German ground that they had, you know, controlled as German ground for quite some time.
You kind of gotta wonder if the Treaty of Versailles wasn't as harsh as it was, if World War II would have been actually really.
Most people looking back think that's probably true, that if World War I had ended with more humane terms for the Germans, that there might not have been a World War II. But it's hard to say because that fervor for expansionism in Germany was so powerful, that German nationalism was so powerful. But this is an example, what's up there right now, this is an example of what might have happened. Gustav Stresemann had taken power. He took power in 1923 and managed to negotiate the end of the occupation of the Ruhr, managed to negotiate the end of hyperinflation, and managed to create a treaty that would allow paying back the reparations at a reasonable rate so the German economy could recover. And German economy did start to recover. You know, the flappers that you see in America, you know, the fine dining and everything that you see in Downton Abbey in the 20s, Germany had that too. They had a whole era of people in fancy dresses and cocktails and hotels and all of that kind of stuff. As a result of this, they had actually turned it around. Then everybody's economy plummeted. The depression that happened in America happened everywhere. Everywhere in a European country, credit speculation ballooned up and then exploded. Banks overextended themselves and then crumbled. So all across Europe, all across Germany, they had the same kind of depression era stuff as they had everywhere else. And when that happened, faith in this new diplomatic, compromising government, the Weimar, government in Germany started to falter, and other parties began to sort of rise. And that's where we get people like Adolf Hitler. Now, Adolf Hitler was a corporal in the military. He wasn't honored for anything really big. He wasn't a big performer of any kind in the military. He himself had been rejected from art school. There really wasn't anything to make him stand out as a leader. He wasn't a child of Junkers, wasn't an aristocrat. He happened to be kind of a charismatic speaker, although if you ever hear him speak, you kind of wonder why, because, I guess you'd have to be German to get why he was such a good speaker. He was very confident, very passionate about everything that he said, but that was about it. But who cares if you're a confident, passionate part of a crowd and you're nobody? You got to actually be put in front of a mic in order to demonstrate how passionate he is. So he joined what was called the National Socialist German Workers' Party, which has a long name, which you can see written there, that we just shortened to Nazis, okay? And the key part of that is not socialist, because he said the socialist part of the name didn't mean anything. The key part of that is nationalist, okay? Nationalist party. So this was a party that cashed in on this belief that there was something special about German people, that there was something special about the Volk, about the German people, that they deserved a destiny, that was grander than the one that they had been given. It was a small party, which is why Hitler rose to prominence in it. It only actually had about 50 people in it at first, and he was one of them, and so he got to speak a lot. But they lied about that on their membership cards. He was like member number 553 or something, but they didn't actually have 500 other people. So they did that to make it seem like they were bigger than they were. So because he was a primary speaker in this party, when election times came, he got to speak in front of larger crowds. The reason that he got a microphone was because he was the most charismatic person in this tiny party, which then grew into this bigger, which then was given a voice at the table with all the other parties. And then he was one of the most charismatic speaker of all of those leaders of parties. Does that make sense? That's how he rose to prominence. But the message of the Nazi Party was the goal was to overturn the Versailles settlement, get rid of the Treaty of Versailles, bring all Germans into a greater Germany. And that meant bringing them back, bringing them in from all of these places where they've been, the Rhineland and Austria and, Eastern Europe, where there were still German people, not to be confused with the Slavic people who are an Untermensch, who are under race. But to bring all of these pure Volk people under one government. Destroy the infiltration of Bolshevism. Now it says it's the National Socialist Party, but Bolshevism is communism. So this is who has taken over Russia is Bolsheviks, which are communists. So he wants to eradicate the idea of communism from Germany. And then conquer and colonize Eastern Europe to make what's called living space for this master German race that deserves a better. He himself also was incredibly anti-Semitic and believes that, part of German rising to power means getting rid of the Jews. And he puts that right in in his early years. He gets arrested for participating in a riot, the beer hall putsch, and while he's in prison, he writes Mein Kampf. Huh? Yeah.
Did they use the Great Depression as kind of an anti-Semitic?
Oh yeah, because who was still making money?
Yeah,
Because the money lenders still had money, and who were the money lenders? Yeah, absolutely. According to the anti-Semitic German people, oh yeah, the Jews are definitely partly at fault for the Great Depression.
Okay.
They're at fault for the Treaty of Versailles. They're at fault for the weakness of World War I. They're at fault for a lot of things, which they weren't really, but it made really easy message to grab onto. And that's what you need in a fascist movement. You need easy messages that are easy for people to repeat and grab onto and hold on to. You need catchwords like Lebensraum, living space, things like that. You need it to keep it simple so that everybody can line themselves up in the same little bundle.
Hey, Mindy.
Yes.
Mein Kampf, well, if you've read it, I'm sure you have. He has some incredibly intelligent things to say.
But it's rambling.
Yeah, I know. Unfortunately, he's a lunatic, but the chapter on propaganda is eye-opening. I recommend it.
Yeah, he rambles a lot in Mein Kampf. It's rambling amendment, but inside it are these seeds of, oh crap, oh he's right, oh no, oh no. He said right there that was what he was going to do. He said it right there. Yeah, but his one of the things that his whole party agreed on, his whole committee, everybody that supported him agreed on, is if you put a message out strong enough, eventually people will believe it. Eventually becomes true. So he becomes chancellor in 1933 and immediately sets out to carry out these goals. And the first thing that he does is start building up the military against the Treaty of Versailles without the permission of the other powers. He begins bulking up the military. There's a joke, I think, about a man who works at a cradle factory, and because he has a baby coming, he steals a part from a cradle every day or every week. He brings home one part from the cradle factory, and at the end of when it's almost time for his baby to be due, he assembles it, and it turns out that it's a bomb. That was a joke about how Germany was turning its factories over to war production without telling anybody, without telling the other powers that that's what their factories were doing. But that is what they were doing. They were investing massively in war production. And the European powers may have known, but were like, if we go in and start to try to enforce this, we're basically asking for another war, and nobody wants that. That's the message of Europe at this time. Nobody wants another World War I. Nobody wants that, not even Germany. So we'll just let them get away with a couple of little things, but they don't want to go to war again, surely. Nobody wants that. One of the first things that he does is march troops into the Rhineland, which, is not really very well occupied anymore anyway, and most of the occupants of the Rhineland are overwhelmingly for this. They vote to be annexed. They're like, please come and annex us. We belong to Germany anyway. So it's no trouble at all to march troops into the Rhineland. It's absolutely bloodless. During 1936, Hitler begins to form alliances with other fascist governments. He supports Spain, where Francisco Franco is having a fascist rebellion against the crown and taking over the government. And he will maintain that control until about 1975. So he's building a fascist government. Spain has its own civil war. And the end result of that is a fascist Spain. And Hitler supports that. Here's a picture of Hitler with Mussolini and Franco all hanging out together. This is Franco here in the middle. And then Hitler and Mussolini, all buddies now, Italy, Spain, and Germany. And the second move he makes is to overturn the Anschluss, which is that Anschluss was that prohibition against uniting Austria and Germany. So he marches into Austria. And again, the Austrians overwhelmingly welcome. Any of y'all seen Sound of Music?
Yeah, they're all for it.
Yeah, for the most part, unless you're Captain Von Trapp himself, for the most part, you welcome the presence of the Germans because it brings order, it brings structure, it makes you part of something strong. We're brothers, basically. The Austrians and Germans are related to each other. It's under Hitler, who was, Viennese. So, they welcome it. This is what we call Anschluss tears, tears of joy, just so overwhelmingly happy that the Germans are marching in. This is a picture of Nazi Jungvolk, young men, the Jungvolk, overseeing Jews scrubbing the streets in Vienna because they could now that the Nazis were there. So they're basically forcing the Jews to polish the streets as an exercise of humiliation in Austria. Then he goes after the Sudetenland. Now, this is a part of Czechoslovakia, and if you look, this is actually like a higher territory. It's like a mountainous. It overlooks this territory, and this part right here is almost all German speaking. It was after the Treaty of Versailles, it was given to Czechoslovakia, but that little section of it right there, that's German speaking. So Germany believes that territory should belong to Germany because it's mostly German speaking people there. And but it also is a high point that overlooks all of Czechoslovakia. So at this point, the other European powers start to get nervous. They start to think, okay, surely he doesn't want another war. Nobody wants another war. Nobody wants that. But just to be on the safe side, let's go ahead and give him the Sudetenland and have him sign an agreement to that effect, saying if we give you the Sudetenland, that'll be it, right? That's all of Germany's expansionist ideas. That's all Germany's going to do, right? Right? And Hitler signs the agreement. This is the Munich Agreement. And the fact that Hitler signed the Munich Agreement and the fact that he then turns around and basically throws it in the trash is the reason for so much that happens in the 20th century, because America remembers that if you appease an expansionist government, you can't appease an expansionist government. We tried in Munich and look what happened. Okay, so appeasing an expansionist government by giving them the little piece that they're basically trying to take anyway doesn't work as a way of stopping them from being expansionist. Hitler forms alliances with other fascist countries. He forms what's called the Pact of Steel with Italy, and that is an agreement to join in forces together and go to war if necessary for each other as they both become expansionist empires, Italy and Germany, to support. It was supposed to be Germany, Italy, and Japan, but and it was a way to basically close in Russia and make sure Russia couldn't expand anymore. But Japan didn't want to agree to exactly the terms that they had, so it starts off just being Italy and Germany. Later, Japan will join them, but at the beginning, it was just the two of them. He also signs what's called the Ribbentrop-Molotov Agreement with Russia, which says, I'm going to invade a little bit of Poland, but I promise I'll stop. In exchange for that, don't stop me, okay? So they both agree that Germany's going to take a sliver of Poland and get Danzig back, basically. And in exchange for that, Russia's not going to fight them on it. Russia's going to let them have it, but they're not allowed to go any further. Very important that they not invade any further into Russia. Okay, so these agreements are both signed in 1939. kind of in the summer of 1939, and in September, Hitler rides into Poland. The European powers have already told him not to. You signed the Munich Agreement, you're not supposed to be taking any more territory. But he does, because he signed this agreement with Russia. And as soon as he does, one of the things that the German hierarchy says is nobody's going to go to war over Danzig. I mean, Danzig is just this teeny little strip, basically. It's this tiny little corridor right here. Can y'all see it? It gives them, this is Germany, and this is Germany, and this is the Danzig corridor. And it basically gives them control of the entire Baltic. That's the point. But surely nobody's going to go to war to prevent them from taking that tiny little sliver. But they do. France and Britain both say, okay, that's it. We had an agreement, you broke it, now we're at war. So that's the beginning of World War II. How y'all doing? Everybody okay so far? Somebody tell me what time it is.
It's 8:50.
Huh?
It's only 8:50.
Okay. All right.
What do you think I said?
I thought you said it was 8:15. I was like, what? I'm in a time loop. Oh, no. Okay. We saw a lot of ground to cover, so I'm going to go through it as quickly as I can. World War II covers this part of Europe expanding and contracting and expanding and contracting. You can kind of see the battle sites of where the battles take place, and they're all kind of on the outside of Germany. It also takes place in North Africa, and actually takes place on every other continent too. So there are World War II activities on every continent. That's why it's called the World War II. We don't have time to cover all of them, but the reason that there are so much, there is so much territory is because there are new technologies involved. World War II is the first place where we have really big air battles. We have high altitude bombings. We have planes flying over countries and dropping bombs on cities, and other planes trying to stop them from doing that. We have paratroopers being dropped in. That's new to World War II, the idea of actually dropping troops from a plane into enemy territory, that's new. Naval technology has come a long way since World War I. There are submarines having battles all over the place. So pretty much everywhere that there's land, air, or sea, there is involvement in World War II, except over North America. North America is only peripherally involved in World War II, and we'll see why later. Germany tries basically the same technique that they tried in World War I, the Schlieffen Plan. They know they have to roll across France as quickly as possible and then turn around and control the border with the USSR. They've already got an agreement with Russia. I called it the USSR. Oh, they've already got an agreement with Russia, not that Russia won't attack their back while they're raiding France. They've already got an agreement. As long as they don't go any further than Danzig, then they don't have to worry about Russia. So their first thing is to go through Belgium. The Allies are expecting it. The Allies are expecting them to go to Belgium. So the Allies park all of their forces on this side of the Ardennes Forest and wait. And Germany comes through the Ardennes Forest in their tanks and knocks down all the trees and just bowls right through. And as a result, they weren't expecting that. They were expecting that they'd come through at a specific point where the Ardennes Forest, which is really, really thick, meets the hills, and that there's this tiny little area of Belgium that you can get through. They're not expecting the Germans to just roll through the trees, which they do. So what happens is that the British troops get stuck here on the coastline and get blocked in a great big hook, which was Germany's intention, was to checkmate Britain and force them to surrender. And the way that they do that is by trapping almost all of the British forces at a place called Dunkirk. Dunkirk is this place right here, and it is a close point to here. They trap all of these men at Dunkirk for days and days and days while the French hold off the Germans. They don't bomb them, even though they could fly over and just bomb all of Dunkirk. They are holding them hostage in order to negotiate a surrender. And any attempt to rescue the men doesn't work. Okay, so it looks like Britain has no choice but to surrender. And then Winston Churchill does something really cool. Yeah, Winston Churchill does something really unexpected. He calls on all the civilians who own a boat because the issue with Dunkirk, the way that it's laid out, you can't get a major troop carrier close enough to the beach to load troops onto it. They have to they have to walk out of a pier onto the boat. By the time they do that, all it takes is one plane to drop a bomb on that troop transport. So that's what happens every time they travel. They're trapped on the beach waiting for their governments to negotiate. And then in one really big move, Winston Churchill sends every civilian with a fishing yacht to the Dunkirk beach all at once. And they managed to rescue a huge percentage of their soldiers and bring them back to Britain. Now it's a retreat, so that looks like a loss, but it's a retreat with most of the military intact, which means that they can turn around and relaunch another attack. Because of that, Britain never surrenders. And Winston Churchill gives this "we shall never surrender" speech, which becomes part of the British mentality for the whole war. Really impresses the Americans, who still haven't decided to get involved in the war. They don't want to go back to World War I. Nobody wants that. So America is only barely supporting the war, but this inspires them to get involved. They sign this attitude of the British to survive all the blitzes, to survive all of the bombings, to continue to fight in the air above their country, causes America to decide to get involved in an economic way through the Lend-Lease aid and send equipment and supplies. But in order to get those equipment and supplies to Britain, they have to do battle with German submarines. So there is a naval battle happening that America is involved in. It's just not overt. It's like under the surface, starting as early as 1944. And then Germany, having control of all of France and all of Belgium and all of Western Europe, turns around and faces Russia, which was part of their plan all along, agreements notwithstanding. They invade into Russia. Operation Barbarossa advances them into Russia, and they are brutal in their attack on Russia. Scorched earth, mass executions, mass deaths, other forms of brutality we don't like to say because they're triggering. They are horrible as they move across the Russian countryside because their goal, say again?
They put Russians in with the Jews and the Gypsies.
Oh yeah, yeah. And they've had concentration camps since before World War I. I don't want you to get the wrong idea about the concentration camps. They've been there all along. Who goes in them and what happens in there has changes over the course of the war. But the Einsatzgruppen, which is the murder squads, they go into Russia and they just shoot people and drop them into ditches. I mean, they don't even bother to send them to camps. They just mass execute people as they go through. Their goal is to so demoralize Russia that it has no choice. Just like dropping bombs on the British on London, their goal is to make Russia feel like it has no choice but to sign a surrender. They make a mistake in thinking that they can chase Russian soldiers into the Russian countryside with German coats, because Russia is actually acclimated to the Russian countryside and Germany isn't. So they extend themselves too far and they end up at Stalingrad, and Russia makes a stand at Stalingrad, and Hitler refuses to let his army retreat from Stalingrad even though they are being defeated. So they end up taking Stalingrad and then being surrounded by Russian army until they are basically annihilated in Stalingrad and forced to surrender. So this is the surrender of German troops in Stalingrad. That's a big turning point. So we've got two big turning points. We've got Dunkirk in Britain and we've got Stalingrad in Russia. Now the Allies are on the offensive. You see how that happened? Like the moments where people actually turn around and start resisting the German advance is where, yeah, okay, so I actually have a map for the surrounding of Stalingrad. They actually have to have trench warfare in the middle of the city. It ends up being house-to-house fighting in Stalingrad. And while they're doing their house-to-house fighting, trying to take over this city full of really recalcitrant Russians, the Russian army actually closes in from the countryside and traps the German army there.
Hey, Mindy,
Yes.
there's a good movie, Enemy at the Gates.
Yeah.
That I recommend that highly.
Yeah, that'll do it. That covers it. Enemy at the Gates. I agree. But this moment is a defining moment because it's at this point that you start to see fractures in the leadership of the Germans saying, dude, I don't think we're actually gonna be able to take over the world. Just my opinion. And they start to get really scared for Hitler's priorities because he is leading to, but what actually gets America involved in the war is Pearl Harbor. So on December 7th, 1941, Japanese planes bombed Pearl Harbor. I'm sure y'all know this story. Y'all know why they bombed Pearl Harbor?
They had told them not to do, if you watch Tora, the Japanese, it was literally the Japanese, they had said not to do it. but they got the message too late.
Yeah, it was, as a strategic move, it doesn't seem to make a whole lot of sense until you recognize how much damage it actually did. Japan is also an expansionist imperial nation, and it is spread into the Korean Peninsula, and in between World War I and World War II, it started to make inroads into China, and its atrocities in China, taking over China, are so substantial that America actually imposed economic sanctions on them in response for example, the rape of Nanking, when they came into the city and basically demolished the city and committed all kinds of atrocities to break the Chinese resistance. Japan wants to annex China and run it basically, and America is preventing that through economic sanctions. But in 1941, Japan signs the Triple Agreement with Italy and Germany, and in exchange for that, America cuts off access to oil for Japan, makes it impossible for them to get oil. And so their response to that is to the oil embargo is to bomb Pearl Harbor to take out the Pacific Fleet, because it's the Pacific Fleet that's carrying out that embargo. That's what's keeping them cut off from the oil. So if they can wipe out the Pacific Fleet, then they can get their oil back. So that's why Japan does that. But now America is involved. This is what the war looks like to America, okay? When most of the time when we see this, we see the map shifted this way. America's over on this side, and Europe and Russia and Japan are over here. This is what it actually looks like to America. They've got people in Europe on their east that they need to worry about, and Japan on their west that they need to worry about. America feels surrounded, okay? Now that they're involved in the war, they're surrounded. So they're gonna go at it with everything they have. Now, America was not set up for war production until they signed that Lend-Lease agreement and became involved in war production. But as soon as they did, every city and every factory basically turned over to war production. And America jumps light years ahead of everybody else in production of war materials. They turn from making washing machines to bombs very, very quickly. And they begin training troops really quickly too. So America getting involved in the war is kind of a big deal. Oh, and just to be on the safe side, they also sequester the Japanese population in America in their own concentration camps. Now, the conditions in those concentration camps don't compare to the conditions in like Auschwitz, but they are still a complete theft of all personal freedom, and in a lot of cases, personal property.
They don't get it back.
Which they often don't get back. The Japanese internment is one of those moments in American history where it's like, oh yeah, that's a thing we did that we're sorry we did, But they believed that what had happened at Pearl Harbor had been precipitated by communications from Japanese American citizens who were Japanese ancestry who were communicating with Japanese powers. And so just to be on the safe side, everybody with Japanese ancestry needed to be sequestered. But now they're in the war. So we have several major moves on behalf of American forces. One of them, of course, is the landing at Normandy. Massive troops, paratroopers jump in if you like, what is it called? Band of Brothers. That's fun to watch, very American exceptionalist, but fun to watch, Band of Brothers. Saving Private Ryan, all of those kinds of things. These are all big pushes on behalf of American forces. They also have American forces in Italy, American forces in North Africa, and American forces in the Pacific that join every fight that's happening. This is the point of the war at which other forces outside of Germany discover the mass murder that's going on in the Holocaust camps. I want that clear because a lot of people think America went to war because of what was happening to the Jews. America not only didn't go to war because of what was happening to the Jews, but there are a lot of anti-Semitic people in America at this time. There are a lot of anti-Semitic people who agree with the danger of having Jews in society at the time. They probably more than we realize. It isn't until American troops are on the ground in Germany, marching across, making progress, defeating Germans, that they come across these Holocaust camps and realize what the Germans have been up to this whole time. This is the final solution to the Germans. It's a way, and it stretches their resources because they're trying to fight this battle in North Africa, they're trying to fight this battle in Russia, and by the way, they're also trying to eradicate all the Jews. So there's like way too much German resources tied up in this. The final solution, gas chambers, was actually supposed to be a way to make it quick and merciful. But you can visit the Holocaust Museum for that. This right here is Ali Wiesel, who just died a couple of years ago. If you were in high school in Texas High, you probably had to read one of his books, Night by Elie Wiesel. Yeah. Ash is back there nodding. Yeah. Okay. On May 2nd, because of the pressure and because they're stretched so thin, Germany's forces collapse further and further back into Germany. They are forced to withdraw, and on May 2nd, the Russians take Berlin. And when they take Berlin, they take vengeance. The Russian occupation of Berlin is probably one of the most brutal war examples of things that happen in Europe. I mean, don't Google images or anything because you won't like what you find. But the Russians were taking revenge for everything that happened by German soldiers as they marched through the countryside of Russia. They took revenge for all of those actions on the civilians of Berlin. So blood, gore, assault, destruction, humiliation that lasted and lasted and lasted. And the other Allied forces weren't in Berlin at the time because Russia had gotten there first, basically. So in the midst of all of that, Hitler commits suicide. He, first of all, just to be clear, as soon as the Russians breach the gates of Berlin and it's obvious that they're going to take it, the first thing that Hitler does is encourage all of the people that are still in Berlin to fight for their lives. Fight and repel this force, old men and young children and women, gather your guns and fight, resist to the last person, and then he commits suicide. Because that's who he is. Anyway,
There's a conspiracy.
a lot of people think maybe he didn't commit suicide and he actually grew old in Argentina. I don't really care. And the point is that he gave up and ran away. Either he gave up and ran away by fleeing the country, or he gave up and ran away by putting a bullet in his own head. It doesn't really matter because he was no longer leading Germany. And what happens when a fascist leader ends, that tears apart the fasc. I mean, it needs the leader in order to continue. Allied forces are already fighting in the Pacific. They're already fighting with Japan, but Japan is now the second big challenge. It's now that we've got Germany under control, we have to take, and Italy is completely wiped out. We have to take Japan and then we'll be done. Japanese battles, Battle of Midway, the theater of the Pacific is by far, in a lot of ways, much harsher on Allied soldiers. It's a worse environment, it's a stronger disease. Even with the freezing winters in the Ardennes forest, even with that, this is harsher. They're short on supplies, they're large on dysentery. And then the POW situation is so much worse. And do y'all remember why the POW situation is so much worse in the Pacific? Because Japanese do not surrender. And if you surrender, what you're basically saying is, please punish me for losing. And so they treat their prisoners of war the way they think that they would want to be treated if they had had the cowardice to surrender, which is, you know, no rights, no, all humiliation, no care. So the prisoner of war situation in Japan is so much worse than the prisoner of war situation in Europe. But gradually over time, mostly through air battles, each of these like little landing field islands are taken until the Allied forces are able to surround and prepare for an invasion of Japan. When Japan prepared for this invasion on their own coast, D-Day style, Normandy style, they were going to have a land invasion. They have hoarded 15,000 planes for kamikaze missions. Kamikaze, that means crash on purpose, die as a pilot, but take out as much as possible. That's what kamikaze means. It means, you know, warrior suicide of a pilot by crashing a plane into the office. They hoarded 15,000 planes for this purpose. They moved 600,000 troops to defend the Japanese coast. And the emperor put out a message to his civilians that every single person should be willing to die before surrendering an inch of ground. So every single civilian would have been taking up arms against this invasion. In preparation for that and knowing this, the US commissioned 635,000 body bags to prepare for this invasion for their own troops. They expected to lose at least 500,000 troops in a single day on that first invasion. But it never happened. Because instead, a little known project that was taking place in Middle America called the Manhattan Project unleashed a new weapon on the Japanese urban centers of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. And those atomic bombs were so devastating and required so little from American troops. And under torture, American prisoner had managed to get the message across that they had a stockpile of 100 of these bombs, which was not true. They had exactly 2, and they were building a 3rd one. But somehow, under torture, an American prisoner of war had gotten the message to a high-ranking Japanese official that America had a stockpile of 100 of these bombs. So the government of Japan faced off with the Emperor of Japan and said, we need to surrender. And the Emperor of Japan agreed to surrender on the condition that Kokutai be preserved. In other words, that Meiji Constitution that y'all studied, that stayed in force, that Japan was able to maintain its government, that Japan was able to maintain the positioning of the emperor, not necessarily Hirohito himself, but the position of the governor of the emperor, that they would surrender and allow American troops to occupy Japan. Now, in light of the Tokugawa isolation, imagine what it is like for the Japanese people to be saying, you can park American troops here. So that's a big concession for them in exchange for surrender. But that's what happened. They signed their surrender August 15th, 1945. Japan surrendered and World War II was over. Okay, how are we doing on time? Okay, we got like 4 whole minutes. Okay, so I wish I could say, and the Allies went home and had a party, and the Axis said, we're sorry for everything that happened, and everybody stopped fighting for decades and decades. But there's so much fallout from what happened during World War II that we're still actually kind of picking through some of the fallout from it. For example, the Nazi ideology was never fully wiped out. Although if you ask anybody except a neo-Nazi in Germany about Nazi Germany, they respond with, that was bad time and we did bad things and we should be sorry.
Japanese don't even teach about it.
Yeah, neither do the German.
The government in Japan shifted from a rhetoric of Japanese exceptionalism to Japanese shame as far as World War II. And they blamed, there were actually lots of ritual suicides among high-ranking government officials for their part in pushing the propaganda. There's a book, something of the floating world, and it's a Japanese name, and I can't remember what it is, but it's something of the floating world, which is about an artist who had been tasked with painting propaganda posters to make people fight World War II, who was now being told to paint anti-propaganda posters and felt kind of a way about it, and that's what the whole book is about.
One of the generals tried to stab himself in the heart, isn't it?
Yeah, there was, yeah, so you have that, but then on the other hand, German households still hang ham in their kitchens to make sure that everybody knows that there are Jews living in their house. So some of that rhetoric is still there, some of the underlying, and of course the fallout from the Holocaust itself, the Nuremberg trials, and
They're still doing that.
there are still, if they can, well, they've run out of people who are alive from that time, but the most recent one was in the 80s. I mean, the trial of a concentration camp official, you know, was actually like in the 80s. So
Was that the one that they found with the school teachers?
yeah, you can find it on Netflix. There's this whole documentary about his trial. But so the fallout from that, and then you know, you've got Holocaust deniers and all this kind of stuff. It all still, and the massive diaspora that happens to the Jews because they are forced to flee. The revolution that they have in Israel and Jordan, which I think you're studying, in that whole area where suddenly there's an influx of people fleeing from Europe who are trying to establish themselves as a country of their own so that they can stop being chased out of other people's countries, because that's apparently a problem. Throughout history, it happened after the plagues, it happened after World War II. Now we just want a country that's our country, and having to defend it against, you know, the people that already live there who aren't Jews causes all kinds of problems. So there's so much fallout from World War II that it basically is never really over. But this is the day officially that the war ends. Have y'all want an interesting World War II experience? I highly recommend the World War II Museum in New Orleans. That's an experience. It's not just a museum with a bunch of exhibits. There's an actual interactive experience involved with it. They have a really great 4D movie called Beyond All Boundaries, very American exceptionalist, but still very cool. And then you get to follow a soldier, an American soldier, either through all of their journeys to get to Berlin or through all of their journeys to get to Tokyo, depending on which soldier you get. And it's a real person, and you get to track their movement throughout the whole war. And it's like a very moving experience. You get to see the airplanes from like 20 stories up. It's very cool. World War II Museum, New Orleans.
They also give
COVID restrictions at the moment, but yes.
a year. I'm a history person, I have fun.
Okay. I don't know, y'all didn't hear that on Zoom, but Ash said, I'm not a history person, but I had fun. So, all right. You do have a document to read this week. Okay. But Chris Howell says Enemy at the Gates is horribly inaccurate and should never ever be used for historical reference. That's true of most historical fiction movies, but if you want a feeling of that experience, Enemy at the Gates is actually pretty good.
Yeah, it's very, 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 it's inaccurate though. It's about like 1941 with John Belushi.
Okay. All right, duly noted. We've got two. We got Sam, who really loves it, and Chris Howell, who says, don't rely on it to teach you history. It's like The Patriot. It gives you a lot of the feeling of the Revolutionary War, but don't rely on it for historical accuracy. Okay,